So thank you very much for a lovely introduction. Yeah, I'm Richard Thompson. I'm based at the University of Plymouth in the UK, and we've been working on plastics there for, well, nearly a quarter of a century, I suppose. My time in the topic goes back. Wasn't what I imagined I would be doing when I trained as a marine ecologist, but it's certainly something that has gained a lot of momentum over time, and it's a large, but not the only part of my research now. So I wanted to spend about 30 minutes looking at the problem of plastics and why I consider it's a wicked problem, and also to think a little bit about the potential solutions that there might be to this challenge presented by plastics and their accumulation in the environment. So depending on your background, I mean, in LimnoPlast, of course, we're interested particularly in plastic in rivers, but I think one of the reasons that I'm so excited about the LimnoPlast project is because of that focus on rivers, and actually the research on rivers to some extent lags behind the number of publications from the marine environment. So a lot of what I'm going to mention here refers to evidence about plastics in the sea, but I'm going to refer to litter moving down rivers as a source of plastics to the sea. If we look at data from shorelines, from beaches all around Europe, we find that there's lots of different types of litter, but the most predominant items are plastic. So about 75% of the litter that's collected from beaches is plastic. There are other materials, metal, glass, paper. Of course, we don't want to see any kind of litter or unwanted debris in the environment, but plastics account for the major proportion. And that quantity of, about 75% on shorelines is typical worldwide. And I think to some extent, my reason for including this slide is I think that although we don't want to see any kind of litter, unwanted items in the natural environment, I think the current focus on plastics is justified. We want to consider those other materials as well, but it's not that plastics are being unnecessarily persecuted, as was once suggested to audiences like this by the plastics industry. If we were to go back a while, they would say, well, why is everybody picking on plastics? And it's not to say the other materials are okay, but a lot of litter is plastic, and I think that justifies a focus. And of course, it's not just the intertidal, it's not just the shorelines. It's difficult to walk on a shoreline anywhere nowadays without finding plastic litter within just a few meters. And that goes everywhere, really, from the poles to the equator, from places that are heavily populated to really remote locations, to polar regions, for example, and uninhabited islands. But even if we take a submarine, to a place never before visited by humans, and here we see on the right the deep sea in an area of the Mediterranean. It's an image from Francois Galgani, and what he shows is that our rubbish, mostly plastic, was there. These places we never even had the opportunity to explore. And even in the deep sea, most of the litter that's found is still plastic. Again, justifying plastics as a material to focus on in terms of reducing litter in the environment. But then I'm guilty of something that I'm about to criticize there, because I'm talking about plastic litter as though it's one thing. And actually there's a whole range of different types of plastic debris. So we've said already that there's different materials, metals, plastic. Even within the plastics, it's not one thing, it's many different types of debris. And so on the left here, you see a large item of mega debris. It's the tail cone, I understand, of a European Space Agency rocket. Now, it's quite rare, quite unusual. It's not all plastic, but it's got plastic composites there. They help to make the rocket lightweight, help to reduce fuel getting the rocket into space. Now, that's an unusual item. I've only found one of those, fortunately, in 25 years of study. But some items of litter are literally so large, we can even see them from satellites in space. But then we start to move down the size continuum, and we get to the microplastics, where we coined the name, these pieces that are typically now described as about less than 5 millimeters. Here we see pieces from the River Tamar near to me in Plymouth, but different polymers, different colors, different shapes, different chemical compositions. And then on the far right hand side, we've got some nanoparticles of plastic. Now those are viewed via electron microscope, and it's a sample that we know is plastic. At the moment, it's really too challenging to pull back pieces of nanomaterial from the environment, from a mixed sample of sediment or animal tissues, and confirm the presence of nanoplastics. It's really right on the edge of our ability to detect those particles in a mixed sample. But most scientists believe that they will be out there. They believe that the larger items, like the space rocket on the left, is breaking down over time into smaller pieces, the microplastics, and those will then break down into the even smaller pieces, the nano. And that size, the shape, the polymer composition, all of those factors are influenced by the source and the original use of the material, but they will also influence the effects of these materials in the environment. I mean, in a way, of course, of concern is the harm. And the size, shape, dimensions, polymer type, all of those features will influence whether or not particular items are harmful. And if they are harmful, how that harm presents itself. So it's a real shortcoming that we often hear the media and policymakers just referring to plastic litter. And actually, it's not that simple. As a collective, the solutions are quite diverse and the impacts are quite diverse. So if I've made the case, even just very briefly, that plastic debris is everywhere, and it's also clear from modeling estimates that the quantity of plastic in the environment will probably triple in the decade between 2015 and 2025. So it's everywhere and it's increasing. And that takes you really to the next logical question, which is a kind of so what? Does it matter? Is this plastic debris harmful to anything? Should we be concerned about it? Do we want to take steps to remove it from the ocean? And it's very clear that there is evidence of harm from a variety of different sources, a variety of different perspectives, I would say. And I think this is important. I put this slide in deliberately to communicate with different audiences, because I think because of that diversity of different types of plastic that I referred to a moment ago, it's important to recognize that there isn't just one type of harm. I mean, we could attempt to produce a kind of toxicology curve, an LC50 as the toxicologists might call it, where 50% of the organisms might die as a consequence of a particular concentration. But that would just be one organism in one lab trial, one type of plastic. And so I asked myself the question, how much does that kind of evidence from a single species toxicology experiment help us? It's useful, but it isn't the whole picture. So I like to consider the harm from a range of different perspectives. So if we consider, first of all, the economic harm, where we can put euro price tag on this litter. And as you'll see later, I think this problem is largely avoidable. And so here, I believe we're wasting money that would be better spent on hospitals, on schools, on salaries for university professors, on PhD studentships. Whatever it is, we didn't ought to be cleaning up mess from our beaches and ports and harbours that is avoidable in the first place. Every year in the UK, we're probably spending 25 million euros every year to clean up this mess, not from the whole coastline, but just from the parts we care about, the tourist beaches, the ports and harbours. In the US, it's estimated about $500 million every year, again, just to clean up some small parts of the coastline. So there's a clear economic cost. There's also emerging evidence of effects on human health and well-being. And in the middle at the bottom, that picture of a beach that's littered is work that I did with Sabina, who'll be giving the second talk this evening, and a PhD student, Kaylee Wiles, where we looked at the effect of very small quantities of litter on, I think what the psychologists would call, if I don't misquote you, Sabine, the restorative value of a trip to the natural environment. We go to the seaside, we go to the natural environment, normally it makes us feel good. Well, even these small quantities of litter you see illustrated here significantly reduce that feel-good factor. And I would argue that that is a wide-scale chronic press disturbance of all of humankind's interaction nowadays with the natural environment because of these quantities of litter that are there. And then Of course, on the far right-hand side, the effects of wildlife are some of the most widely publicized, and we documented these for the Convention on Biological Diversity. In excess of 300 scientific papers describing encounters between wildlife and litter of all types. But 90 or so percent of those encounters are encounters with plastic debris, again justifying the focus, and clear evidence that in many cases those effects, the results of those encounters, are harmful. Now here I would say we know more about the harm from the bigger items of litter than we do the smaller items of litter. We know more about harm from entanglement, as you see here with this marine mammal, than we do as a result of ingestion, because we can only obtain that by dissecting the dead organism. But there's clear evidence of harm, economic harm, harm to human health and well-being, and harm to wildlife. And I think it's only by looking at that in the round, rather than trying to break it down into an individual concentration of plastics that might affect a Daphnia magna in a test tube, a water flea. If you want to look at more evidence about the harm relating to microplastics, I would definitely refer you to this publication by Sapir. It's free to download from the website. It's an expert working group of 20 or so practitioners. I'm personally quite proud that I think it was 20% of all the contributors had started their career at my university and then dispersed over time. But it's an excellent review of the topic. And one of the things I'd point you to is this slide, which is referred to, this graph, this figure, referred to in the document. It's work by Everett. And what it's suggesting here is that if we don't do something to address this challenge, and here it's just looking from the lens of microplastic, said we already know the big stuff is harmful. The small stuff, what the review suggests is at the moment, we're probably not seeing any widespread ecological harm from microplastics. There will be localized places where the concentrations are sufficient to cause harm, but we're not seeing wide-scale ecological harm. But what this graph illustrates is that unless we change our ways, unless we start to reduce the emissions to the environment, we will move into that red zone over time. We'll go from green on the graph to red, where we're starting to see wide-scale ecological harm. And it's anticipated that that is going to happen sometime before 2080. So I think there's a real precedent here that we need to be taking action now towards reducing these emissions to the environment. So I've just made that statement that I think there's a precedent. But I guess the question, and it interests me that it almost divorces itself from the science, because it's a philosophical question I want to put to you. Is there enough evidence already from the summary I've presented that we should, in industry, in policy, as individuals in society, be taking action? Or are there actually knowledge gaps, evidence gaps that need to be filled by scientists before we decide on either whether to take action or what those actions might be? And I think you have to ask yourself, is there enough evidence? I've presented a very short summary. Or are there knowledge gaps that are so substantial that they would prevent us from taking action? There are certainly knowledge gaps, I don't deny that. But a concern that I have, and I've heard some policymakers that don't wish to commit resource to solving or tackling or starting to tackle the problem, have said to me, we're going to wait in our policy measures until you scientists have really understood if this microplastic is actually harmful to humans. We're not going to take any steps until you show me that evidence. And that evidence is going to cost money to obtain. It's going to cost time to obtain. And so I'm kind of posing the question, do we need that evidence? How much evidence of harm is needed? I mean, here are knowledge gaps that, you know, some of you in your careers might start to address. We certainly need to know more about the relative importance of sources. That's the graph on the left. You know, tire particles as portrayed there as being the second most important source. And that's taken up by the media. But we don't really have very clear information on tire particles. If I ask an audience of researchers who's found a tire particle, very few of them say that they have. And yet we're seeing evidence here presented to policy saying tire particles are the second most important source. They may well be the second most important source, but we have a really low confidence about that. Whereas some of the other things in that graph on the left, we have much better certainty over. We also have uncertainty about the effects of nano, and I touched on that a moment ago. This is a slide of some work that we did with a postdoc at the University of Plymouth, looking at the uptake of nanoparticles into a commercially important mollusk, and it showed that these tiny plastic particles, these really tiny pieces, could permeate throughout the whole of the mollusk's tissue within a matter of just a few hours, but they would remain there. Actually, we were able to trace them for, I think, over 40 days, retained in the mollusk. The concentrations were declining, but there was some retention. It doesn't prove harm, but it's a step on the way towards understanding whether there might be harm. If we can understand which vital organs within the tissues of a creature are accumulating these really tiny pieces of plastic. So there's lots of unknowns, and including the question that the policy maker put to me about the toxicological effects on humans. We know very little about that. But it's going to be almost impossible to get to that. It would cost a lot of money to get to that. And in a minute, I'm going to come on to some of the solutions. And I'd argue it may be far cheaper to get to grips with the solutions than it might be in dotting our I's and crossing our T's about every evidence gap. I think that one evidence gap that's really critical and really delights me about LimnoPlast is the shortage in minerals and freshwater bodies. 2015, this UN report, only 5 mentions of the word river. When we get to 2016, a UNEP report, now we're up to 49 mentions of rivers. So the trajectory is rapid, but it is a knowledge gap, understanding the pathways via rivers to the oceans. The quote in that UNEP report is, rivers present a key entry point of macro and microplastics to the oceans, and that catchments and drainage areas, particularly with high population densities, could present a significant plastic load. We need to try to quantify that. And I think this is important also from a social science and integration perspective, because effectively it links the actions of citizens that could be living hundreds, if not thousands of kilometers from the ocean, with the consequences in the ocean that we see so widely reported in the media. But actually it's the actions of all of us and our use and disposal of plastics that's going to be important, because these freshwater bodies, many of them are flowing directly to the oceans. I mean, excellent study here done along the Rhine, and I'll leave you to look at that later on, showing the quantities and types and relative importance of sources as we move along that freshwater body towards the North Sea. But then we also get extrapolations. We get modeling studies that try to extrapolate which are the most important rivers on the planet in terms of their contamination. And it's not so much a criticism of this study, it's a criticism of the risk of the interpretation. The last study in the Rhine was empirical data. It was real counts of plastic in real places. Here, we're largely working on extrapolation of waste management and water flows, and there's less empirical data to back it up. So it's an estimate. It might be the best estimate we've got, but so frequently I see policymakers present data like this, and I see industry presenting data like this, and they particularly disingenuously sometimes use it to present a case, to present an argument that all of this problem associated with plastic in the environment is originating from these countries in the Far East with these heavily contaminating rivers. And sometimes it's an attempt even to present it that is the litter that contaminates our shorelines in Europe. And that really isn't the case. It's our own litter that's contaminating our shorelines. So there are evidence gaps, and there's modeling and there's estimation. And I think it's useful, but we need to be clear between the data that is empirical and real data and the modeling estimates that are actually hypotheses about where the plastic is, as opposed to where it actually is. They remain to be tested, I would argue. So if you're of the view, as I am, that there is enough evidence to start to take action, what then are the solutions? And that's the key bit that we really need to work on, to establish what the solutions are. And they relate to I would say, to our design, use, and disposal of plastics. We need to do that more responsibly, but it's right along the supply chain. It's not just the disposal. It's not just a consequence of littering. The problem is systemic, and it comes right the way from design, as I will try to illustrate. I do really very, very strongly, although it's only one slide, one point, that in my view, plastics are not the enemy. They are absolutely not the enemy. Plastics have the potential to reduce our footprint on the planet. if we use them responsibly. Plastics can bring lightweight parts in cars and aeroplanes that will help to reduce carbon emissions. They can provide thousands of novel applications in hospitals and schools that bring societal benefit. In packaging, which is often one of the things that is criticized so widely, this plastic packaging helps to extend the life of food and drink and so reduce food wastage, which is a major environmental problem, probably a bigger challenge than the accumulation of plastics. So it's not the plastics per se, or the use of the plastics, that is causing the harm. So what we need to try to do is to learn to get these benefits without the associated environmental problems that we're currently seeing. And in most cases, I would argue that those benefits can be achieved without the harm. They can be achieved without the accumulation of plastics in the environment. And that's different to many of the other challenges that we face. So typically, the environmental degradation that marine biologists like I see and attempt to quantify is directly and inextricably coupled to something us humans want, whether that's extracting fish from the sea or building property or infrastructure along coastlines that takes away natural habitat, or the carbon emissions from a car journey or an aeroplane journey. So typically the thing that we want is intrinsically linked to the thing that's causing harm. But if you think about those benefits of plastic on the left, none of them will automatically and compulsorily result in the harm that we're seeing on the right. So it's not about not using plastics, I'd argue, it's about using them more responsibly. Some go to the extreme of saying we need a plastic-free aisle in the supermarket. I think that could bring bigger environmental costs in food wastage. I do think that there's a case for material reduction. I think we have applications of plastic that we simply didn't need in the first place. And we need to take action there. You know, we don't need a throwaway plastic bag every time we go to the shop. We need to reaccustom ourselves to take a bag with us. Probably we don't need a drinking straw every time we buy children a soft drink. But a plastic-free aisle, I'm not sure that's going too far in my view. How did we get into this state then? If I'm making the case that plastics aren't the problem, why aren't we in a mess? I'd argue it's because we've had 60 years of design and 60 years of effectively consumer training, of training society, because of a lack of thought at the design stage. We've been training citizens for a convenience-driven, throwaway, linear society. The picture on the left is a family in the 1950s. It's in Time Life magazine. The article around it extols the virtues, the benefits to that family of the convenience that a throwaway living will bring them. At that time, we were making 5 million tons of plastic globally. Probably that amount of waste, although I don't like to see it, could be considered acceptable. But today, we're making over 360 million tons of plastic globally. 40% of it is single-use items. We cannot afford that linear waste of resource to accumulation of waste. But if I ask the designers, they've never, they tell me, been asked to consider end of life. They've been asked to design products for functionality, convenience, and linearity. Linear use, short-lived applications to waste. So it's hardly surprising we have the problem on our hands. It's hardly surprising that the picture on the right, which is litter from a shoreline, 50% of what we pick up are single-use items of plastic, because we've not designed a place for that plastic to go. And with that pedigree, it doesn't surprise me that some citizens decide the best way to dispose of their plastic is simply to throw it away. And yet, materials are inherently fairly recyclable. And so in my view, the problem in the sea or in the river isn't actually the problem we should be addressing. It's the symptom of a problem, the symptom of a much wider problem, which is this linear use of resource. In this case, the carbon in most of the plastic is from non-renewable oil and gas, 8% of world oil production going into making plastics. Some of that plastic is ending up as rapidly through short-lived applications as waste in landfill, as waste in incineration. Some of it is ending up in the oceans or in the rivers as litter. The litter you could consider material that's escaped waste management. But I'd argue even our waste management isn't adequate enough to really tackle this linear waste of resource, of non-renewable fossil oil and gas. And we need to get the material going around in a more circular way. And we need to make sure we're designing value in so the plastics can move around in a circular manner. If we do that, we achieve multiple synergies because we decouple ourselves from the fossil oil and gas as the carbon source, because the carbon source becomes the old plastic. We decouple ourselves from the waste that we're burying or burning in managed systems. And we decouple ourselves from the need for litter to accumulate in the environment. So there's a real win here by, yes, reducing plastics we didn't need in the first place, but where the applications are essential, moving over towards a more circular use. I just want to kind of finish by giving a few examples of why I think the design stage is so critical in this. Here we see the microbeads in cosmetics. We've seen now legislation in many countries to prohibit the use of these tiny pieces of plastic in a cosmetic. Nothing the consumer could do to prevent those particles escaping when you have a shower, and some will then pass to wastewater treatment and be captured, but some will escape to the environment. You couldn't, as a consumer, take these small pieces to be recycled. It seemed to me avoidable. Why did we need to be cleansing ourselves with millions and millions of small pieces of plastic? And why do I point to the design stage? Because yes, we're now thankfully seeing legislation in countries to prohibit this, but the patent on the use of microplastics in cosmetics was filed 50 years ago. Did no designer or producer in the industry ever ask the question during that 50 years of production, where are all these pieces going? And could it possibly present a harmful consequence? I'm slightly flabbergasted if they didn't. Maybe it was burying heads in the sand. But this has to stem from better design. The same you could say of the textile fibers which are released in their hundreds of thousands from garments that we wash in domestic washing machines. And yet, if we look at different garments purchased from the same store with a similar functionality, we showed from some of the work at the University of Plymouth that could be a five-fold difference in the quantity of fibers released in a single wash. And to put it another way, some garments were releasing fibers 80% less quickly than other garments. So again, there's something there we can do at the design stage to significantly reduce fiber emissions. We won't eliminate it, but if we could reduce it by 80% by better design, that would be a massive step forward. And yet, when we have discussions, and this is a slide I presented to the OECD, there's uncertainty. Where do we act? There's some that are saying we need to act on microfibers in wastewater treatment. We need to spend millions on infrastructure to capture them. And then when we've captured these microplastics in wastewater, we will take the resultant sludge, and in some countries, we will spray it back onto the land, complete with the microplastic burden. So we're spending millions to catch it, and then we're putting it back in the environment. And then there's another school of thought that says we all need to fit a device in our washing machine to capture these microplastic fibers. And then on the far right, my suggestion is, let's think about it from the drawing board, from the design stage. If we could eliminate 80% of this fiber emission from the design stage, that would reduce the need for some of these other measures. And heck, it would also make our clothes last longer and be more sustainable. So the design stage is absolutely key. There are issues with some potential solutions starting to emerge that are maybe promoted in a way that isn't quite honest, and I see this with materials that are labeled as biodegradable plastics that actually are very slow to degrade or will only degrade under certain conditions, typically in a commercial composter. And yet those conditions or the need for that specific waste management pathway are not communicated to the consumer. The consumer is left tantalizingly potentially believing that a biodegradable product is something benign that will degrade naturally and harmlessly in the open environment, when that's far from the case. Here we see a plastic carrier bag labeled as being biodegradable. It's been in the sea for over 3 years, but you can still carry a full load of shopping groceries home in it. So that there are issues here where we're seeing solutions coming to market that could be solutions, but they're not necessarily being completely and effectively marketed or labeled or communicated how they fit in to tackle the problem. So the consumer is left confused, understandably, about biodegradables. We also see a final example on the right here of 2 plastic bottles made from a highly recyclable polymer. They're made of PET. That plastic polymer is lightweight and durable. It's probably a far better way to bring you those drinks than glass would be. It's highly recyclable. We've known it for decades. And yet here, the product designer has chosen to incorporate colorings which render those plastics challenging to recycle. Not technically challenging, but they halve the value of the plastics to the recycler. So they make it non-viable to recycle them. So with a single stroke of inadequate, inappropriate thought at the design stage, we've taken a polymer that we've known for decades is highly recyclable, has value in recycling, and we've made it hard for the recycler to recycle it. We've made it hard for those bottles to join the circular economy. So the design stage, in my view, fundamentally has to wake up. So in conclusion, I think many in society and in policy and in industry have reached the conclusion on the left that there is a consensus, I'd argue, that the current situation is bad and that it needs to change. We might argue about, you know, the numbers of turtles affected or the extent of the ecosystem effect, or when we'll see wide-scale effects of microplastics. But most people seem to agree there is a problem. And so in my view, that automatically takes you to what do we do about it? And that is the area where, in my view, we are really lacking clear environmental science that is independent to provide the solutions, and particularly to provide the trade-offs between those solutions. We know it's about reducing, we know it's about recycling, we know in some cases it might be banning, in other cases it might be cleaning up, but we have a very poor understanding of how those different solutions trade off against each other, which circumstances, and also in which geographies, because it will depend on the waste management infrastructure available to apply which kinds of solutions, and which education and social science to apply to try to reinforce those messages. So I feel the biggest evidence gap, in my view, relates to independent evidence about the trade-offs between solutions. If we get that evidence and we can guide, as independent scientists, policy and industry, towards a better norm, we go to the green circle, and as we see progress, that starts to reinforce behaviors. It starts to catalyze the change because people see that we're making headway. But if we guess at it and start to introduce products that are not properly tested or not properly labeled or leave the consumer confused, then it seems inevitable we could end up in a worse place of unintended consequences, a bad or even worse situation than we have at the moment. So I would urge you, some of those listening as the scientists of the future, there is a real opportunity here to harness this current interest and to help to guide policy and industry towards optimizing solutions rather than drifting by chance into chaos and unintended consequences. What I have seen over the last 20 years, unfortunately, are some of these actions. I've seen denial by industry and policy. I've seen deflection by redefining the products people are making to try to get them to not be part of legal considerations, defining pieces by different sizes so they're no longer technically a microplastic and so therefore wouldn't be exempt. I've seen delaying tactics. But now, and I've seen definition games about, is my product plastic or not? If it's still becoming litter, I think there's a design need to think about it. Now we're starting to see market impact. We're seeing consumers moving away from plastic, and that is starting to bite. But regrettably, because there have been these denial and deflection tactics, I think the industry is not as prepared as it could have been. And that we need to change that. We need to help the industry, because these aren't deliberate. It's just a little bit, I think, of having a head in the sand. We need to help to guide industry towards more responsible use of plastics, more responsible design. If it's designed properly, then the onus is on each and every one of us as citizens to use it properly and to dispose of it properly. But if it's in theory compatible with recycling, but the poor job done by the designer has made it challenging to recycle, no matter how hard we try, that plastic will not join the circular economy. It has to start with systemic change from the design stage, and we use that to catalyze and reinforce behavioral changes with products that work in a circular economy. And that needs to be reinforced by policy instruments to make things fair for industry, to make it a level playing field, that we're not seeing imports of less well-designed materials coming in from overseas and flooding the market and undercutting the better producers. So we can only solve this with industry, society and policy all pulling together. If we don't fix it, then, as I've said already, by 2025 there could be 3 times as much plastic in the sea as there was in 2015. There's a real precedent for us to take action now. Once it's in the ocean, it's going to be incredibly difficult to remove. The smaller it gets by fragmentation into micro and nano, it's going to become almost impossible to remove. So there's a real precedent for us to seize this nettle now and move towards reducing the sources of plastic to the ocean and the accumulation of waste plastic in managed systems, in landfill and incineration. So in summary, I would say that the litter in the oceans or in the rivers or on a mountainside isn't the problem itself. It is the symptom of the problem. It's a symptom of an outdated business model. And by that, I mean this linear use of resource through very short-lived applications to waste. The benefits of plastic, which are clearly there, are not directly coupled to these impacts. And so putting it another way, it certainly isn't about not using plastics. It's about being more responsible about the way we use them. There is clear evidence of damage to economy, wildlife, and services. And there's also clear evidence of solutions. There's no single solution, and we're missing a lot of key information about the trade-offs between solutions. I think the key thing is to focus on designing products that work during their life in service, that give the performance we expect, but also bringing to the drawing board that critical consideration, which has been so far lacking, of end of life. If we do that, then there is a real synergy in reducing our reliance on non-renewable oil and gas and reducing waste generation at the same time. The answer, I think, is in harvesting this current interest in plastics, which some that work in different disciplines get really frustrated about. You know, you could argue that climate change is a far more pressing concern for us than plastics. But plastics has captured the mood of the moment, and I think it's a problem that we can fix. I think we need to get on with doing that and maybe not worry too much about chasing millions and millions of euro on human health research, trying to establish whether a nanoparticle might be harmful to us. Let's focus on the solutions. Harness that current interest, focus it on design and waste management. And in doing all of this, I think that environmental science that comes from independent bodies such as universities is absolutely fundamental. I mean, it is patently clear that we cannot rely on industry to be its own gatekeeper. You can see that from the example of the patent on the microbeads in cosmetics and their use for over 50 years until an environmental scientist working with me counted them all and showed that a single container had 3 million particles in it. And that woke people up. So we've got to act from the design stage, but we need reliable, independent scientific advice to help to lead us towards better solutions for more responsible use of plastics in society and less plastics as litter and waste. So that's me, Tom. If you want to find out about more of the work that we've been doing at the University of Plymouth, by all means, Google the International Marine Litter Research Unit.